Unfinished tasks haunt your team's memory far more than finished ones ever will. There is a name for this. Psychologists call it the Zeigarnik effect. It comes from an observation about restaurant waiters, and once you understand it, you will start seeing it everywhere in how your own team works. The story starts with a psychologist who noticed something strange while sitting in a busy restaurant. Waiters were juggling many tables at once, each with a different order. Some tables had already paid their bill and left. Others were still eating, their orders still open on the books. When the psychologist asked the waiters to recall the details, something odd happened. They could describe the still open orders in remarkable detail. Which table wanted the sauce on the side? Which one asked for a substitution? Which one still owed for a drink refill? But the moment a bill was paid and the transaction closed, those same details slipped away almost instantly. Ask a waiter about a table that checked out 10 minutes ago, and the memory is already fuzzy. Ask about a table still eating, mid-order, and the details are sharp and immediate. That contrast is the whole effect in miniature. An open task stays vivid in memory. A closed task fades fast. Later research confirmed this was not just a quirk of restaurants. The same pattern shows up in offices, hospitals, classrooms, and factories. Interrupted or incomplete tasks tend to stay mentally active. They keep replaying quietly in the background of your mind, almost like a browser tab you forgot to close. Completed tasks, on the other hand, get mentally filed away and released, the way a browser tab closes and stops eating up memory the moment you shut it. Understanding why this happens matters more than just knowing that it happens. Your brain has limited working memory, a kind of mental scratch pad it uses to track things that still need attention. When a task is unfinished, some part of your mind treats it as unresolved business, a loop that has not closed. That loop does not just sit there quietly waiting. It actively pulls at your attention, nudging you to think about it at inconvenient moments, resurfacing while you are trying to focus on something completely unrelated. This is why a single unfinished email can quietly drain your focus for an entire day, even while you are sitting in a meeting that has nothing to do with that email. Your conscious mind has moved on to the meeting. Some other part of your mind has not moved on at all. It is still holding the door open on that email, waiting for you to come back and close it properly. A useful way to picture this is to think of working memory like a computer's active memory, the part that runs whatever is currently open, rather than the hard drive where finished files sit quietly in storage. A finished task gets written to the hard drive and closed. It stops consuming active resources. An unfinished task stays loaded in active memory, running in the background, quietly consuming processing power, even while you are focused on something else entirely. The more unfinished tasks a person is carrying, the more of that active memory is already spoken for before the workday even properly begins. Eventually, the system starts to slow down everywhere, not because any single task is too demanding, but because too many background processes are running at once, each one small, each one still draining a little capacity nobody remembers is being spent. There is also a well-documented connection between unfinished tasks and what researchers sometimes call attention residue, the lingering pull of a previous task on your focus even after you have physically moved on to a new one. Someone who leaves a meeting mid-discussion to jump on a call often performs worse on the call than someone who finished the meeting cleanly first, because part of their attention is still sitting back in that unfinished conversation. This residue effect compounds throughout a normal workday, since most people do not move from one fully closed task to the next. They move from one half-open task to another half-open task, dragging small, trailing threads of attention along with them the entire time, whether they notice it happening or not. Think about how this plays out for an ordinary employee on an ordinary day. They start the morning on a report that gets interrupted by an urgent phone call. They switch to the phone call, which gets interrupted by a colleague stopping by their desk with a question. They answer the question, then try to return to the report, but now there are 3 half-open loops running simultaneously instead of one. The report is still open. The phone call may have left a follow-up item unresolved. The colleague's question may have raised something that needs checking later. None of these tasks are difficult individually. The cumulative weight of holding all 3 open at once is what actually drains a person by the end of the day, far more than the raw hours of work would suggest on paper. This has real, measurable consequences inside teams, not just an individual, private discomfort. Employees who are juggling many partially finished projects at once tend to report higher stress levels than employees managing fewer total tasks, even when the overall workload, measured in hours or output, is roughly the same. It is not the amount of work that wears people down the fastest, it is the number of open loops running at the same time, each one quietly consuming a slice of mental bandwidth, whether or not anyone is actively working on it in that exact moment. A person with 5 tasks and 2 of them finished feels lighter than a person with 3 tasks and none of them finished, even though the second person technically has less on their plate. This shows up clearly around remote and hybrid teams too, where the natural closing signals of a physical office, walking out of a meeting room, packing up a desk, watching a colleague physically leave, simply do not exist in the same way. Without those natural cues, a workday can blur into a single, continuous stretch where nothing ever visibly ends and every task quietly stays open in the background because there was never a clear moment where it was declared finished. A team spread across many home offices and time zones is especially vulnerable to this, since asynchronous work already fragments tasks into smaller pieces, each one easy to start and surprisingly easy to leave, dangling half-done for days at a time. Onboarding a new employee is another place this shows up in a very concrete way. A new hire often gets handed a long list of setup tasks, training modules, introductory meetings, and small early assignments, almost none of which get a clear, visible close. Weeks in, that person can feel oddly exhausted despite doing relatively little actual output, simply because dozens of small onboarding threads are still technically open, each one sitting quietly in the back of their mind. A manager who closes each onboarding step explicitly, marking it done and saying so out loud, gives that new employee noticeably more mental room to actually focus on real work, faster than a manager who lets the list simply exist in the background indefinitely. Constant task switching makes this dramatically worse, because it multiplies the number of open loops without ever actually closing any of them. Picture a workday built entirely around short bursts of different projects, a common pattern in fast-moving offices. A person opens a spreadsheet, gets pulled into a chat message, opens a slide deck, gets pulled into a quick call, and returns to the spreadsheet an hour later having made no clean stopping point anywhere along the way. Every one of those interruptions leaves a small, unresolved thread behind. By the end of the day, the person is not tired because any single task was hard. They are tired because they are quietly holding 6 or 7 open loops in their head at once, none of them closed, all of them faintly humming in the background like tabs nobody remembers opening. But here is the part that most managers completely miss, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The instinct inside most companies is to treat this kind of fatigue as a workload problem, something to solve by hiring more people or trimming the task list. That instinct is only half right, and sometimes it is not right at all. 2 employees can have the exact same number of hours logged and the exact same list of deliverables, and one of them can feel completely fine while the other feels frayed and depleted. The difference usually is not the size of the list, it is how many items on that list are sitting open with no clear finishing point in sight versus how many have a clean, visible close. This is where a slightly contrarian point is worth making out loud, because it cuts against how most workplaces are actually run. Busy culture, the kind that rewards constant multitasking and treats a packed calendar as a badge of honor, is not neutral with respect to this effect. It is actively hostile to it. A culture that prizes juggling many things at once is, by definition, a culture that maximizes the number of open loops any one person is carrying at any given time. It looks productive from the outside, all that motion and activity, but it is quietly engineering the exact mental conditions that produce burnout. Not because people are working too many hours, but because almost nothing they touch ever gets a clean closed ending. A team that finishes fewer things at a time, deliberately, on purpose, can genuinely outperform a team that starts more things and closes almost none of them, simply because closed loops stop taxing attention and open ones never do. None of this means every project should be small or that ambitious long-running work is bad. Big projects are unavoidable, and some things genuinely take months to finish. The mistake is treating a big project as one enormous, undifferentiated open loop with a single finish line sitting far off in the distance. A project structured that way gives the brain nothing to close along the way, no signal, ever, that anything is actually done, right up until the very end. Every single day of that project feels equally open, equally unresolved, equally present in the back of a person's mind, whether real progress happened that day or not. This is also where team morale quietly erodes on long projects, even when nobody can point to a specific complaint. A 6-month initiative with no visible closing points anywhere inside it produces a strange kind of low-grade fatigue that never fully goes away, because the mind never gets a single moment to file anything and rest. Compare that to a 6-month initiative broken into 6 distinct visible phases, each with its own small close. The total amount of work is identical. The lived experience of doing that work is not identical at all, because one version hands the brain regular opportunities to exhale, and the other never does. Smart managers use the Zeigarnik effect deliberately, instead of accidentally fighting it. The fix starts with breaking large projects into smaller, genuinely closable milestones. Not just checklist items that get marked done without ceremony, but real, visible completion points that the brain can register as an actual ending. A milestone is not just a status update. It functions as a small, repeated dose of psychological relief, a chance for the mind to file something away and stop replaying it in the background. Instead of one distant finish line sitting 3 months away, a well-structured project gives someone a real sense of closure every week, sometimes every few days, each one lightening the mental load a little before the next stretch of work begins. There is a second, smaller habit that works surprisingly well alongside larger milestones, and it costs almost nothing to implement. Before ending any individual work session, write down a clear, specific next step for whatever is still unfinished. Not a vague reminder to keep working on the report, but a precise instruction, like start with the second paragraph, or send the follow-up question to finance before continuing. This single habit seems almost too small to matter, and yet it consistently helps, because it tricks the mind into treating the loop as parked rather than abandoned. The unfinished task is still unfinished. Nothing about the actual work has changed, but the mind no longer has to hold every detail active just to make sure nothing gets lost. The details are safely written down somewhere retrievable, and the open loop can finally quiet down until the person actually returns to it. Managers can build this directly into how they run teams, not as an abstract wellness tip, but as an actual operating habit. End meetings by having each person state one clear next step out loud, not a general intention, but a specific action tied to a specific unfinished task. Structure project check-ins around what got closed since the last check-in, not just what got started, since starting things is easy and closing them is where the real friction usually lives. Celebrate finishing, visibly and specifically, the same way many teams already celebrate the launch of something new. A team that only ever celebrates kickoffs and never celebrates completions is quietly training everyone inside it to open more loops than they ever close, and every one of those open loops keeps taxing attention, long after the celebration for starting it has faded. The standard status meeting is worth rethinking through this same lens. Most status meetings ask a single question: what are you working on? Which, by design, surfaces every open loop a person is carrying without ever asking which ones are actually finished. A meeting built that way subtly reinforces the exact problem it is trying to manage, since it trains people to narrate their unfinished business out loud every single week without ever getting the psychological relief of narrating a close. Flipping the format, asking what got finished since we last spoke before asking what is still open, costs nothing to implement and changes the emotional tone of the entire meeting almost immediately. People leave feeling like something moved, rather than feeling like the list of open items simply grew a little longer again. It is also worth being honest about where this pattern can be misused, since any insight about human psychology can be turned into a manipulation tactic if a manager is careless with it. Manufacturing artificial milestones purely to generate a dopamine hit without any real underlying progress tends to backfire once employees notice the pattern, and employees notice this kind of thing faster than most managers expect. The milestones have to represent genuine progress towards something that matters, not a hollow checkbox designed only to make people feel busy. The goal is not to trick anyone's brain into feeling relief it has not earned. It is to structure real work so that real progress gets a real, visible closing point, instead of disappearing invisibly into one enormous, undifferentiated project that never seems to end. Individual employees can use the same logic without waiting for a manager to redesign anything. Keeping a short, visible list of only what is currently open, rather than a sprawling backlog of everything that could ever be done, keeps the number of active loops small enough to actually track. Reviewing that list at the end of each day, moving finished items off it deliberately rather than just scrolling past them, gives the same closing signal a manager would give a whole team, just at the scale of one person's own workload. It sounds almost too simple to matter, yet the difference between a task that is quietly abandoned mid-thought and a task that is deliberately closed out, even for the day, shows up directly in how rested a person feels by evening. None of this requires elaborate systems or expensive software to put into practice. It mostly requires noticing where the open loops actually are and building small, deliberate closing points around them, rather than letting every project drift toward one distant, undifferentiated deadline. Follow along for more lessons from real companies, because this pattern shows up in more places than most people expect once they start actually looking for it. Unfinished tasks haunt your team's memory far more than finished ones ever will. But that haunting is not a fixed cost of doing business. Give your team more finish lines along the way, not just one deadline sitting months in the distance, and watch how much lighter the exact same workload starts to feel.